Dignity is not the chair they offer you. It is the room that changes when you stand. At 8:17 p.m., snow fell over West 57th Street in slow white sheets, softening the black hoods of chauffeured sedans lined outside the old Marlowe Cinema, where gold marquee lights burned against the glass towers above Midtown. From the 42nd floor lounges across the avenue, the city looked warm and alive, every window glowing like a promise, while the marriage inside Aurelia Jameson's chauffeured car felt colder than the pavement beneath the red carpet. The air smelled of wet wool, camera batteries, expensive perfume, and the faint metallic bite of winter drifting through the open curbside doors. Aurelia did not shiver. She stepped out in a deep wine-red gown with long sleeves and a high neckline, her smooth brown skin catching the flashbulbs with a calm that made reporters lower their voices without knowing why. She had grown up 40 blocks north of rooms like this, in walk-up apartments where heat hissed through old radiators and scholarship letters were treated like sacred paper. Tonight, every sponsor banner outside the Marlowe existed because she had spent 6 years turning quiet donor dinners, private arts pledges, and reputation risk language into a $38 million patronage structure that Preston Fairchild liked to call his vision. He called it vision. Aurelia called it work. Preston arrived 30 seconds after her in a charcoal Brioni tuxedo, pale-skinned, polished, handsome in the kind of way cameras rewarded, his smile practiced enough to look sincere from 20 feet away. He lived for the clean angle, the printed quote, the morning headline that made him seem generous without requiring him to be humble. Beside him, Kasia Beaumont glided from the second car in a champagne silk gown, pale hair pinned loosely, one hand already lifting toward the photographers as if the evening had been arranged for her entrance. She treated attention like proof of worth. The red carpet stretched 40 yards from curb to brass doors, flanked by velvet ropes, security in black coats, and a sponsor wall where the Fairchild name stood beside Aurelia's charitable initiative in letters tall enough to be seen from 6th Avenue. Inside, through the glass, ushers moved along the aisles placing ivory seat cards on the front row, each card printed with embossed names under the heading Principal Patron Seating. Aurelia noticed the young event assistant first, a woman no older than 26, standing near the check-in table with a tablet in one hand and fear tightening her mouth. Something had changed. The assistant looked at Preston, then at Kasia, then at Aurelia, and finally down at the ivory card she was trying to hide beneath the seating chart folder. Aurelia saw her own name. Then she saw where it was no longer placed. Preston leaned close, his breath carrying mint and old confidence, and said softly, "We needed a fresher image tonight." Kasia lowered her eyes with a delicate smile that did not reach them, pretending embarrassment while making sure the cameras could still find her face. On the digital seating chart, Kasia Beaumont now occupied the center seat beside Preston, the red carpet honor chair reserved for the principal benefactor's spouse and founding architect of the sponsorship package. Aurelia's name had been moved 7 seats away, past a studio attorney, 2 minor donors, and a vacant aisle meant for late arrivals. 7 seats. That was his measurement of her value. The snow pressed harder against the cinema windows, and from the towers above, Manhattan glittered like another world watching a colder one unfold below. Reporters called Preston's name, and he lifted Kasia's hand just high enough for the cameras to understand the message without anyone having to say it aloud. He wanted a new story. Aurelia looked at the sponsor wall, at the $38 million figure hidden behind velvet language, at the logo arrangement governed by the Prestige Patronage Covenant, the optics breach provision, and the reputational exposure trigger he had once signed without reading past page 3. Then she looked at the chair that had been taken from her, not with pain, but with recognition. A chair could be moved by arrogance. A sponsorship could be moved by authority. Inside the Marlowe Cinema, the lobby glowed with amber chandeliers, black marble floors, and glass cases holding old film reels polished like relics for people who preferred history when it came with velvet ropes. Snow tapped softly against the tall front windows, while far above West 57th Street the office towers burned with late-night light, each floor looking warmer than the marriage Aurelia had just been asked to perform inside. At 8:29 p.m., an usher in white gloves guided Kasia Beaumont toward the front row, where the ivory card reading Kasia Beaumont now sat beneath a brass lamp marked Principal Patron Seating. Preston smiled. He smiled for variety, for town and country, for the local CBS crew standing 12 feet from the aisle, and for every donor who believed a polished man in a tuxedo must also be a decent man. He placed one hand at Cash's lower back with careful public manners, not enough to seem crude, just enough to make the message travel faster than language. Across the lobby, in the darker angle beside a velvet curtain, Aurelia stood still with her black evening clutch held in both hands. The red of her gown deepened by shadow until it looked almost like sealed wine. She did not move. Under the lights, Preston laughed lightly as a reporter asked whether the night felt personal. In the corner, Aurelia watched the sponsor wall reflect in the glass doors, her face divided by city lights and falling snow. Under the lights, Kasha tilted her champagne silk dress toward the cameras. In the corner, Aurelia counted the spacing between the letters of her own initiative and the Fairchild crest, knowing exactly which side had supplied the money, the donor confidence, and the legal authority. Under the lights, Preston lifted 2 fingers in a casual salute to a studio chairman. In the corner, Aurelia remembered page 17 of the Prestige Patronage Covenant, where public misuse of founding benefactor status triggered immediate review. The room had 2 stories. Kasha sat first, crossing her ankles like someone trained by magazines rather than responsibility, while the brass nameplate on the chair caught a line of light from the aisle lamp. Preston bent near her ear and said something that made her laugh, a pretty empty sound that floated above the orchestra tuning in the pit. Aurelia's reassigned seat waited 7 places down, beside a retired distributor who had already spilled a drop of soda water onto his program. 7 seats stood between her and the place she had earned. A junior publicist approached Aurelia with an apologetic smile and a replacement card, its edges already bent from nervous handling. The card had been printed on thick ivory stock, the kind donors noticed, the kind committees pretended did not matter while arranging entire evenings around it. Aurelia took it between 2 fingers, felt the raised ink of her name, then looked toward Preston as he accepted congratulations beside the woman now sitting where the founding architect was supposed to sit. The card split cleanly in half. The only sound was the dry tear of embossed paper between Aurelia's fingers, small enough for the microphones to miss and sharp enough for the young publicist to stop breathing. Preston did not see it, because he was busy telling a film columnist that Kasha had brought fresh energy to the cause, though Kasha had mispronounced the beneficiary foundation's name twice in 3 minutes. When the columnist asked Kasha how the $38 million sponsorship would expand legal access for vulnerable women, she blinked, smiled, and said she believed cinema could make everyone feel beautiful. A man from the donor council lowered his glass by 1 inch, and that 1 inch told Aurelia more than any headline could. Kasha knew nothing. Aurelia opened her clutch and checked the small silver-framed phone Preston called old-fashioned because it did not photograph well in lifestyle spreads. There were 4 unread messages from Nadia Bell, the financial attorney who had helped structure the optics breach provision, the reputational exposure trigger, the principal benefactor override, and the capital morality rider into language even powerful men could not charm their way around. The latest message arrived at 8:33 p.m., exactly as the house lights dimmed by 20%. Aurelia read it once. Nadia had written only 9 words. If he moved your seat, he moved the money. Aurelia looked back at the front row, where Preston's laugh softened under the chandelier, while Kasha rested one pale hand on the stolen armrest. In the shadowed corner, Aurelia slid the broken ivory card into her clutch like evidence, not sentiment. Outside, snow thickened over the red carpet, turning the velvet ropes white at the edges, while the towers above the avenue kept shining like expensive witnesses. The city watched coldly. Then Aurelia typed 3 words to Nadia, steady as a signature being placed on marble. Prepare the trigger. At 8:41 p.m., the first applause rose inside the Marlowe Cinema, polished and obedient, the kind of applause wealthy rooms gave before deciding whether they meant it. The auditorium smelled of velvet seats, warmed brass, winter coats drying along the aisles, and the faint sweetness of champagne carried in from the lobby. Outside the front windows, snow kept falling over West 57th Street, and above the cinema, the high towers glimmered with white office light, making the city look expensive and emotionally untouched. Aurelia stayed in the dark. Under the chandeliers, Preston Fairchild leaned toward Kasia Beaumont and laughed as if the evening had rewarded him. In the shadow near the side exit, Aurelia stood with the torn ivory seat card hidden inside her clutch, her face calm enough to unsettle anyone who knew the cost of quiet. Under the chandeliers, Kasia lifted her chin toward the photographers still hovering near the aisle. In the shadow, Aurelia watched the sponsor wall pulse on the lobby monitor, each logo sitting under authority language Preston had never respected. Under the chandeliers, Preston accepted a whispered compliment from a studio executive. In the shadow, Aurelia unlocked her phone and opened the encrypted message thread with Nadia Bell. The divide was complete. Nadia's next message arrived at 8:42 p.m., 7 seconds after the house manager announced the donor acknowledgments would begin in 10 minutes. Optics breach provision is active if the seating change was authorized by him, Nadia wrote, followed by a photo of the internal seating revision timestamped 7:56 p.m. and approved under Preston's office code. Aurelia looked at the time, then at the front row, where Preston sat with Kasia in the stolen patron seat, his posture loose with the comfort of a man who believed humiliation was harmless when done elegantly. He had signed the evidence himself. Aurelia did not answer immediately. She stepped to the check-in table where the young assistant had placed the original seating folder beside a crystal bowl of black and gold programs. The assistant's hands shook as she began to apologize again, but Aurelia raised one palm, gentle and final, because the girl was not the author of the insult. You did your job. Aurelia took the brass-edged seating card holder from the table, removed the revised slip bearing Kasia's name, and placed it flat beneath the lobby light. The card looked harmless, almost beautiful, with its creamy stock and embossed ink, but Aurelia knew objects in wealthy rooms were rarely just objects. They were declarations. She pressed her thumb against the brass-edged holder and closed it over Kasia's name until the hinge clicked shut. The only sound was the soft crack of the brass-edged holder closing over a name that had never earned the seat. In the auditorium, Preston's laugh rose again, warmer than the room deserved, while Kasia touched his sleeve and pretended not to notice the donor council whispering behind them. In the lobby shadow, Aurelia removed a small matte gold lapel pin from the inside of her clutch, a worn pin shaped like a simple open door, given to her 13 years earlier by the Women's Legal Aid Center on 125th Street after she helped rebuild their first scholarship ledger. It was not expensive. It mattered. She placed the pin beside her original seat card on the check-in table, leaving it where Preston would eventually have to see that something older than his money had walked out of the room. Then she opened the draft Nadia had prepared, silent sponsorship withdrawal instrument, tied to the prestige patronage covenant, the reputational exposure trigger, the principal benefactor override, and the capital morality rider. The document did not mention heartbreak. It did not mention Kasia. It stated that the founding benefactor's identity and protected patronage position had been publicly displaced for reputationally adverse personal optics, thereby activating immediate review and suspension of all controlled sponsorship assets totaling $38 million, including media placement, donor use rights, sponsor wall display, after-party underwriting, and charitable name association. Preston had wanted a fresher image. Aurelia gave him a cleaner balance sheet. At 8:47 p.m., she walked toward the side doors while the city lights flashed blue-white through the snow beyond the glass, each step quiet against the marble floor. Under the chandeliers, Preston raised his hand to greet the audience. In the dark exit corridor, Aurelia paused only long enough to look back at the room he thought he owned. Her voice was low enough for one frightened assistant and one security guard to hear. A seat is easy to steal. A foundation is not. Then she signed with her thumbprint. The only sound was the clean, digital chime of authorization passing through her phone as $38 million in sponsorship authority began freezing beyond Preston Fairchild's reach. At 9:06 p.m., Aurelia Jameson's car stopped outside a narrow limestone building on East 64th Street, 6 blocks from the roar of the Marlow but a world away from its velvet ropes. Snow slid down the black windows in thin silver lines, and above Park Avenue the high apartments glowed with warm kitchens, private libraries, and marriages that looked peaceful only from a distance. The elevator smelled faintly of cedar polish, cold wool, and the lavender hand cream Aurelia had used since law school, a small human scent against the machinery of wealth. She was done performing. On the 9th floor, Nadia Bell was already waiting inside a quiet office with no family portraits, no Fairchild crest, and no ornamental proof that money had passed through the room. The wall screen showed the Marlowe live stream on mute. Under the chandelier light, Preston leaned toward Kasia and laughed at something a studio chairman had said. In the dim office reflection, Aurelia stood still with melted snow darkening the hem of her wine-red gown. Under the lights, Preston raised a glass as if the night still belonged to him. In the quiet, Aurelia opened a steel-gray portfolio embossed with one name Preston had not spoken in years. Aurelia Vale Initiative. Under the lights, Kasia smiled from the stolen patron's seat. In the quiet, Nadia placed 5 documents across the walnut table with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. The screen told one story. The paperwork told another. Nadia did not ask whether Aurelia was all right, because women like them had learned that survival often required fewer questions and better clauses. She pointed first to the prestige patronage covenant, then to the reputational exposure trigger, then to the principal benefactor override, each page marked with blue tabs and signed acknowledgments from Preston's own legal office dated March 14, 2021. The total exposure was not symbolic. $38 million in controlled sponsorship assets, $11. $6 million in pledged media placement, for $2 million in after-premiere underwriting, and access to a donor list that had taken Aurelia 6 years and 73 private meetings to build. Preston had moved a chair. Aurelia moved the architecture. Nadia slid forward the silent sponsorship withdrawal instrument, already populated with the Marlowe timestamp, the seating revision log, the donor chair displacement record, and the optics risk notation from the event assistance tablet. The language was cold enough to survive any courtroom and elegant enough to terrify any boardroom. Unauthorized reputational displacement of the founding patron, adverse personal optics attached to protected philanthropic identity, immediate suspension of name association and capital visibility. It did not accuse. It executed. Aurelia removed the small open-door lapel pin from the inner pocket of her clutch and set it at the top of the page. 13 years earlier, on 125th Street, that pin had been given to her by a women's legal aid center after she rebuilt their scholarship ledger for free while studying at Columbia on borrowed books and vending machine dinners. Now the same symbol sat beside a financial instrument precise enough to strip Preston's stage of its authorized backing without raising her voice. The only sound was the soft click of the open-door pin touching the signature line, a modest piece of metal landing heavier than any diamond in the room. Nadia turned the screen toward her. At the Marlowe, Preston stepped toward the podium, smiling beneath gold light, while Kasia arranged her champagne silk skirt in the front row as if stillness could look like importance. In the office corner, Aurelia read the final clause aloud in a voice that barely disturbed the air. Capital Morality Rider confirms immediate donor separation upon misuse of protected patronage identity. Nadia nodded once. Aurelia signed. The digital seal formed in the lower right corner at 9:12 p.m., followed by the authorization code AV 125, a private reference to the street where her first door had opened. Across town, the sponsor wall behind Preston flickered once, then steadied, as if the building itself had inhaled before losing its breath. The Fairchild crest vanished from the center line. Then the media partner logo disappeared. Then the after-party underwriting banner went black. Under the lights, Preston's smile held for half a second too long. In the 9th floor quiet, Aurelia closed the portfolio, bearing her maiden name, and placed her palm over it like a promise to every woman who had ever been moved 7 seats away from her own work. "Begin the recall," she said. At 9:18 p.m., the Marlowe Cinema still looked alive from the street, its gold marquee cutting through the snow while black cars idled along West 57th Street, with their hazard lights blinking like nervous pulses. Inside, the auditorium remained warm with velvet, perfume, and the expensive confidence of people who believed every crisis could be softened by dim lighting. Above Midtown, glass towers shimmered through the storm, each high window glowing amber against the blue-black night, while Aurelia's 9th-floor office stayed almost dark except for the clean white light of the documents on the walnut table. Two rooms breathed at once. Under the lights, Preston Fairchild stepped to the podium with Kasia Beaumont seated perfectly in the stolen patron chair. In the corner darkness of the livestream reflection, Aurelia stood silent beside Nadia Bell, her wine-red gown still dusted at the hem with melted snow. Under the lights, Preston smiled at the audience as if nothing had shifted. In the quiet, Aurelia watched the first donor dashboard turn from active green to suspended gray. Under the lights, Kasia tilted her champagne silk shoulder toward the cameras. In the quiet, Nadia opened the Aurelia Vale Initiative transfer panel and moved the cursor over the restricted capital authorization line. The applause thinned. Preston began his remarks with the polished warmth he used at charity luncheons, thanking the Fairchild family's commitment to the arts and pausing for the expected applause. But behind him, the sponsor wall refreshed again, and the center column where the Fairchild crest had been suddenly showed only a blank charcoal rectangle. A studio executive in row 2 turned to his assistant. A luxury brand director checked her phone. A donor council member stood without waiting for permission. The room understood absence. At 9:21 p.m., Nadia received confirmation from 3 linked institutions. The media placement escrow was frozen, the after-premiere underwriting was rescinded, and the donor use license had reverted to Aurelia Vale Initiative under the principal benefactor override. Aurelia did not smile. She read the numbers as if reading weather, $11. $6 million no longer attached to Preston's publicity package for $2 million removed from the after-party budget, and 73 donor relationships reassigned to a governance channel bearing her mother's maiden name. This was not revenge. This was accounting. Nadia slid a second document across the table, the Capital Visibility Reassignment Notice, not a general agreement, not a vague promise, but a precision instrument built for rooms where reputation moved faster than money. The notice redirected all charitable name association, beneficiary reporting, scholarship allocations, and women's legal access funding away from Fairchild Public Image Office and into Aurelia Vale Initiative, effective 9:22 p.m. Eastern Time. In one line, it protected the women the evening was supposed to serve from becoming decoration for Preston's personal vanity. Aurelia picked up the matte black signing tablet. The only sound was the firm tap of her fingertips sealing the Capital Visibility Reassignment Notice, a small contact of skin on glass that carried more weight than every camera flash inside the Marlowe. Across town, Preston reached the sentence about generosity and stopped, because the teleprompter had updated with a producer's emergency note he was not meant to read aloud. Kasia's smile faded by 2 degrees, then returned too quickly, the way empty confidence always returned when it did not yet understand the bill. In the office, Aurelia opened the first public statement for Aurelia Vale Initiative, a restrained announcement of scholarships, legal aid fellowships, emergency housing grants, and founder training for women pushed out of rooms they had helped build. She named no mistress. She named no husband. She named the work. Under the lights, Preston laughed softly and told the audience there had been a minor technical delay. In the dark office, Aurelia watched 6 partner calls arrive and decline his office in real time. Under the lights, Kasia touched the stolen armrest as if possession could become legitimacy. In the dark office, Aurelia authorized the first $2 million scholarship reserve under the Open Door Fellowship. Under the lights, the room waited for a man to explain what he no longer controlled. In the dark office, the woman who built it gave them money somewhere safer to stand. At 9:27 p.m., the Marlowe sponsor wall refreshed for the final time, and the words Aurelia Vale Initiative remained as the only authorized benefactor beneath the beneficiary title, clean, centered, and impossible to misread. Preston turned his head just enough to see it. Aurelia closed the portfolio with her maiden name on the cover. The only sound was the soft magnetic clasp catching shut, like a door closing gently on a life that had mistaken her silence for permission. At 9:34 p.m., the Marlowe Cinema stopped feeling like a premiere and began feeling like a room trying to hide a structural crack behind applause. Snow pressed against the tall lobby windows in thick white strokes, and the city lights above West 57th Street glittered through the storm as if Manhattan had chosen to watch from a safer height. Inside the auditorium, the air smelled of hot stage lamps, velvet dust, chilled champagne, and the faint panic of expensive people checking their phones under their programs. Preston kept smiling. Under the lights, Preston Fairchild laughed into the microphone and called the sponsor wall failure, a charming New York technical moment. In the darker aisle near the exit, a studio executive read the Capital Visibility reassignment notice twice and stopped smiling. Under the lights, Kasia Beaumont sat with her champagne silk dress arranged like a magazine photograph. In the shadow of row 3, a donor council member whispered Aurelia Vale's name as if it had suddenly become the only name that mattered. Under the lights, Preston lifted one hand to calm the audience. In the 9th floor office on East 64th Street, Aurelia stood beside Nadia Bell without moving, watching every partner channel reroute away from him. The room was learning arithmetic. At 9:36 p.m., the first call came from Harrigan and Low Media Placement, a firm Preston had boasted about securing during a private dinner 3 weeks earlier at $2,700 per plate. Their message was formal, cold, and only 4 lines long. All promotional inventory tied to the Fairchild-facing campaign was suspended under the reputational exposure trigger until governance authority could be verified. 2 minutes later, Belmont Lux suspended its jewelry placement from the after-premiere reception pending benefactor governance verification. At 9:39 p.m., the streaming partner demanded a revised underwriting schedule without Fairchild Public Image Office listed as capital sponsor. The cascade had begun. In the Marlowe, Preston stepped away from the podium and covered the microphone with 2 fingers, but the gesture only made him look smaller on the side screens. His chief of staff hurried toward him with a tablet, face pale beneath the amber chandelier glow, and showed him the suspended asset list, $11. 6 million media placement frozen, $4. 2 million reception underwriting removed, $8. 7 million donor match pool transferred, 73 donor contacts sealed behind Aurelia Vale Initiative Governance. Preston stared at the numbers. They did not flatter him. Kasia leaned toward him and whispered something with a bright, worried smile. But Preston did not answer because he was seeing for the first time that the chair he had moved was attached to a floor he did not own. In the office, Nadia placed a narrow white envelope on the walnut table, its front printed with the words Donor Access Continuity Seal. It contained the emergency governance key that would prevent Preston's staff from using Aurelia's donor network to beg their way back into control. Aurelia picked it up, waited for half a second, and broke the paper seal with her thumb. The only sound was the crisp split of the white envelope opening, a small paper wound that cut Preston's empire more cleanly than a public accusation ever could. Under the lights, Preston laughed again, too loudly, telling the room that generosity had many moving parts. In the dark office, Aurelia authorized donor continuity through the principal benefactor override. Under the lights, Kasia touched Preston's sleeve and asked whether they should leave. In the dark office, Nadia watched 31 donor confirmations acknowledge Aurelia Vale governance within 90 seconds. Under the lights, a man tried to keep his image standing. In the dark, the woman who built the image removed its foundation. At 9:44 p.m., a producer approached the podium and whispered that the after-party at the private screening lounge could no longer proceed under its announced sponsors. A luxury car partner pulled its curbside fleet from the front entrance. The step-and-repeat crew began removing the physical side panels while the central LED wall stayed blank, their black gloves leaving pale streaks where logos had been. Preston saw the cameras turn from the film stars to the empty spaces behind him. Kasia finally understood enough to become afraid, though not enough to become useful. She whispered, "You said she only handled charity details." Preston looked toward the side exit where Aurelia had disappeared, and for the first time that night, his smile failed before the cameras did. In the East 64th Street office, Aurelia closed the donor dashboard at 9:46 p.m. and looked out at the high windows across Park Avenue, where warm apartments shone through falling snow like lives protected by glass. She did not celebrate. She simply watched the money find its proper name. "Let them call her," Aurelia said. At 10:03 p.m., the Marlowe Cinema's lobby had changed from luxury to damage control, though the chandeliers still glowed as if gold light could launder embarrassment. Snow kept building along the red carpet outside. softening the velvet ropes and burying the tire marks where luxury cars had already begun leaving West 57th Street. Above Midtown, the glass towers shone in orderly rows, warm squares of light stacked high above a marriage collapsing in public silence. Preston kept performing. Under the lights, Preston Fairchild gave a clipped laugh to a society columnist and said the evening was evolving beautifully. In the darkened service corridor, Aurelia's name moved across donor phones like a password that still opened every serious door. Under the lights, Kasia Beaumont clung to her champagne silk composure, smiling at cameras that no longer admired her. In the East 64th Street office, Aurelia stood still beside Nadia Bell, reading a beneficiary report for women's legal aid fellowships instead of watching Kasia suffer. Under the lights, Preston waved away concern with the same hand that had guided his mistress to Aurelia's chair. In the quiet, Aurelia approved the Open Door Fellowship's first emergency reserve with no announcement, no speech, no spectacle. The contrast was cruel because it was factual. By 10:07 p.m., the first headline draft had already reached 3 publicists. Principal benefactor suspends Marlowe premier backing after patron seat dispute. Another outlet was harsher, calling Kasia the woman in the benefactor's seat, and the phrase began moving faster than Preston's team could soften it. In a glass-walled side lounge behind the auditorium, Kasia watched her reflection tremble over a city of snow and headlights. Her lipstick still perfect, her confidence no longer useful. She had wanted the seat. She had not understood the invoice attached to it. Preston entered the lounge with 2 phones in his hand and no patience left in his face, his Brioni tuxedo suddenly looking less like armor and more like costume. Kasia turned on him before he could speak, whispering that he had promised Aurelia was only ceremonial, only charitable, only quiet. Preston told her she had answered donor questions like someone invited to a photograph, not a boardroom, and Kasia's mouth hardened because she knew charm was her only credential and he had just audited it in public. Their romance became accounting. At 10:11 p.m., a junior producer showed Preston a compliance camera clip from the event production desk. Kasia at 7:51 p.m., holding Aurelia's ivory seat card, asking the assistant whether the switch could happen before cameras arrived. The clip was only 19 seconds long. It was enough. Kasia reached for the tablet, but Preston pulled it back, and the polished black screen caught both their faces in one reflection. His panic, her calculation, and behind them the blurred city lights looking clean because they were far away. The only sound was the flat crack of the tablet case snapping shut over the paused image of Kasia holding Aurelia's name. Under the lights, Preston returned to the lobby and smiled too broadly for a photographer. In the shadow of the side lounge, Kasia checked her phone and saw 2 stylists, 1 brand rep, and a magazine editor withdraw invitations within 6 minutes. Under the lights, he told donors that transitions always created confusion. In the quiet office, Aurelia signed the Women's Access Reserve allocation under the Capital Morality Rider. Under the lights, he tried to make the scandal look like weather. In the quiet, she turned weather into shelter for women who had never been given a front-row seat anywhere. Nadia asked whether Aurelia wanted to respond to the gossip sites, and Aurelia shook her head once. At 10:19 p.m., Aurelia Vale Initiative released a statement of 78 words, naming scholarships, legal aid fellowships, emergency housing grants, and founder training, without naming Preston or Kasia at all. It was elegant, disciplined, and impossible to attack without sounding small. Preston read it on his phone beneath the Marlowe chandelier, surrounded by people who had already begun stepping backward from him in increments of 6 inches. Kasia watched him read and realized the wife she had mocked had not fought for a chair because she had been busy building a table. Outside, snow covered the red carpet until the color beneath looked less like glamour and more like something being quietly erased. In the 9th floor office, Aurelia closed the beneficiary file, placed the open door pin beside it, and looked once toward the high city lights beyond Park Avenue. "No more decoration," she said. For years later, at 7:18 p.m., snow returned to New York with the same quiet discipline, falling over the restored Hudson Rail Arts Center on West 30th Street, where an abandoned freight terminal had been remade into glass, steel, and warm oak without losing the bones of its working past. Through the high arched windows, The city towers shimmered beyond the river, their upper floors bright against the winter dark, while inside, brass lamps glowed over scholarship tables, legal aid booths, founder clinics, and young women holding folders like passports into lives no one had handed them. The air smelled of cedar panels, wet coats, espresso, fresh paper, and orange peel from the donor reception, a human warmth the old Marlowe cinema had never possessed. Aurelia had arrived as herself. She no longer entered rooms as Mrs. Fairchild, no longer stood half a step behind a man who needed applause to locate his worth, no longer wore dignity like armor because no one in this room had mistaken her quiet for permission. Tonight, the program read Aurelia Vale Jameson, founder and chair, Aurelia Vale Initiative, and beneath her name sat numbers no gossip column could cheapen. 4,800 women served, 312 legal fellowships funded, 96 founder grants issued, and $74 million moved through protected philanthropic channels under the Capital Morality Rider and the Beneficiary Integrity Covenant. Work had become witness. Under the lights, Aurelia stood at the center of the restored rail hall in a deep garnet gown, her smooth brown skin luminous beneath the lamps, listening as a former open-door fellow described buying her first office printer with a $5,000 grant. In the darker rear aisle, Preston Fairchild stood alone near a concrete pillar, older at the jaw, thinner in the smile, his charcoal suit still expensive but no longer persuasive. In 4 years, he had resigned from 2 arts boards, lost 3 donor circles, and learned that wealth could buy tables but not trust. Under the lights, donors rose when Aurelia's name was spoken. In the shadow, Preston tried a small laugh with a former studio chairman who pretended not to hear him. Under the lights, young founders crossed the room to thank Aurelia with both hands around hers. In the shadow, Preston checked his phone and found no one calling him back. The room remembered value. Kasia Beaumont was not there, though her absence had the shape of an old headline everyone had stopped reading. After the Marlowe scandal, the phrase "the woman in the patron's seat" had followed her through 3 canceled brand lunches, 2 awkward magazine corrections, and 1 brief attempt to sell herself as a misunderstood advocate. By the 2nd year, even Preston had stopped defending her because there was nothing left to defend except vanity wearing silk. Their glamour had expired faster than the flowers at an after-party. At 7:42 p.m., Nadia Bell stepped onto the small stage and announced the expansion of the Open Door Fellowship into 5 states, backed by a new $18 million Women's Access Reserve governed by the Principal Benefactor Override and the Community Capital Stewardship Charter. The applause was not polished this time. It was full, uneven, grateful, and real. Aurelia received the ceremonial authorization folio, a slim white case embossed with an open door, and held it for only a second before signing the expansion seal. The only sound was the clean press of the gold clasp opening on the white folio, soft as a promise and final as a verdict. In the rear aisle, Preston watched that sound move through him like weather entering an old crack. He remembered the Marlowe, the stolen chair, the blank sponsor wall, the exact moment the room had stopped believing he controlled anything. He remembered Aurelia's face in the shadow, still enough to seem distant, close enough to have been merciful if he had understood her sooner. When the ceremony ended at 8:06 p.m., snow thickened outside the rail hall windows, blurring the towers into pale columns of light. Aurelia stepped down from the stage, greeted fellows, donors, attorneys, and mothers carrying toddlers asleep against their shoulders, each person part of the world she had built after leaving his. Preston waited until the crowd thinned by 12 feet, then stepped forward with both hands visible, as if approaching a border he knew he had no right to cross. "Aurelia," he said. She turned calmly. Preston Fairchild stood 12 feet from Aurelia Vale Jameson beneath the warm brass lamps of the Hudson Rail Arts Center, while snow pressed softly against the high arched windows, and the city towers beyond the river glowed like distant apartments belonging to people who had learned how to stay. The old version of him would have filled the silence with charm, with a donor's name, with some polished explanation shaped for the nearest camera. This version only looked tired, expensive, and late. Aurelia waited. He glanced toward the stage where her white authorization folio still rested beside the open door emblem, then toward the young women gathered near the fellowship tables, Women who laughed without asking permission to take up space. I watched what you built, Preston said, his voice lower than she remembered. I should have known your work was holding my name upright. Aurelia did not correct him quickly, because the truth deserved room to stand. For years earlier, he had given Kasia Beaumont the red carpet seat that belonged to the founding architect of the night, believing a chair could replace a woman. 4 years earlier, Aurelia had walked into the snow, activated the patronage instruments Preston had signed and ignored, and locked the entire $38 million sponsorship authority beyond his polished smile. He had mistaken public humiliation for power. Preston looked past her at the donor wall, where Aurelia Vale Initiative now stood alone, clean and bright, attached to real fellowships, real legal access, real housing grants, and real women who would never know how close their funding had once come to being used as decoration for a man's vanity. I was cruel, he said. I was arrogant. I made you invisible because I needed to feel larger. The admission arrived without music, without applause, without the drama he used to demand from every room. Aurelia felt no triumph. She had imagined this moment once, years earlier, when pain still tried to dress itself as justice, but the woman standing in the rail hall no longer needed him to suffer in order for her life to make sense. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not reopening the door. It was removing his name from the lock. Preston stepped one pace closer, careful, hopeful in a way that would once have softened her. Could we talk sometime? He asked. Not about the past. About beginning again. The snow thickened outside, turning the river lights into pale streaks, and for one quiet second Aurelia remembered the Marlowe cinema. The stolen ivory seat card, Cash's champagne silk, Preston laughing under chandeliers, the sponsor wall going blank, and the clean digital chime that locked $38 million in sponsorship authority beyond a man who thought love was ornamental. The only sound now was the soft closing of the white authorization folio as Nadia Bell gathered it from the stage table, a gentle clasp that felt like the final page of a life already signed. Aurelia looked at Preston with kindness, but kindness was not surrender. I forgive you, she said, not because you repaired what you broke, but because I refused to carry broken things for men who called them gifts. His eyes lowered. Around them, the rail hall kept breathing, donors speaking softly, fellows exchanging cards, a mother buttoning her child's coat, Nadia waiting near the exit without interrupting. Aurelia continued, calm and exact. You gave my seat away because you thought it was the source of my dignity. I pulled the authority behind the sponsorship because I knew the seat was only a symbol. What mattered was the structure, the women, the work, and the name I had before you tried to make me smaller. Preston nodded once, and in that nod she saw the full measure of his loss. Not only a wife, not only a fortune of influence, but the one person who had made his public life appear moral. He had kept the cameras. She had kept the power behind them. Aurelia turned toward the young founders waiting for her by the open doors, their folders held close, their futures still unfolding. She did not hate him anymore. She simply had no place left in her life for a man who needed to lose everything before recognizing who had built it. Preston whispered her name again, but this time it did not pull her backward. Aurelia gave him one final, peaceful look. Not anymore, Preston. Some endings do not arrive with rage. They arrive with a woman walking toward the life she funded, protected, and finally claimed under her own name. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.